Hey, everybody, and welcome back. It is the very first Sunday of the brand new year. Welcome to 2026. I hope all of you are just as excited about this brand new year, and if not, we definitely have to change that. Anyways, can you believe that it's officially episode 19? Yeah, the time flies when you're really having fun and just running around doing your own dungeon stuff. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, which is episode 19 of This Is Why I'm Not Invited. For those of you who are new here, my podcast is about kink, community, boundaries, and the things that people pretend not to notice until it becomes a problem. As many of you know, whenever I open my mouth, everybody looks away. And that's just how I'm going to keep it. I am keeping it that way in 2026. Get it together or ship out, right? So, one of the things that I do want to move forward with about today's podcast is basically kind of answering questions that have been a constant theme for me as a dungeon owner. People, they have a really weird mental association with the word dungeon. They hear the word dungeon and they think they're about to be tackled in the dark. That's wild. Because most of those same people go to clubs where strangers grab them, shove drinks into their hands, and no one even knows what consent is. No one asks for anything, and no one even checks what consent is at all. So today, I want to talk about what people think happens in a dungeon versus what actually happens in the dungeon. This is not at all about convincing anybody to come. It's about replacing fear and perception with reality. I think the very first thing that we have to start off with is just realistically coming to terms that in the vanilla world, people think of the word dungeon and one of their immediate emotions is fear. Most vanilla people don't avoid dungeons because they don't like kink or they hate kink. They avoid dungeons because their brain has filled in the blanks with violence. They imagine chaos, loss of control, pain without consent, and basically being trapped and not having a way out. That fear doesn't come from lived experience or real experience. I feel like that kind of fear actually comes from silence and no transparency from the kink world. When people don't understand a space, they assume the worst part of it, and their brain will just automatically assume the worst version of it. Also, keep in mind that if we actually talk about the word dungeon, historically, it's been taught to everybody as a place where really bad and horrific things happen. So when people are making these assumptions, when they hear the word dungeon, they basically take the little bit of the knowledge that they have been given and fill in the blanks about what happens or what occurs in like real time, real space. If I've said it once before, I'm going to say it again. Media is a terrible teacher of what kink is. Most people learn about kink from porn, bad jokes, and in real life worst case scenarios, horror stories. Porn, not once have I seen any kind of negotiation for the hardcore or the harder core porn. Movies, they don't talk about consent. And stories, these focus on extremes. They focus on serial killers, right? They focus on all of these horrible, horrific murderers and serial killers and all of that stuff, where they talk about them having a homemade dungeon, which actually I wouldn't necessarily use that in the terms that we use it today in the kink terms. That place is literally like a snuff area. That's where people go to die. So when we talk about our kink spaces, people don't fear what dungeons actually are. They fear what the media has trained them to imagine. There's a really big myth that I hear consistently in the vanilla aspects of vanilla people when I start talking about the dungeon space and them coming to my space. The one that I get the most that I think is just absolutely outrageous and outlandish and literally the extreme is that people honestly think that when they come to a dungeon, they're going to be attacked. One of the most common fears is literally, what if someone touches me without permission? Which I think is completely ironic because I too have been to so many vanilla clubs, dive bars, dance clubs, insert places here. Honestly, dungeons are some of the only places where that is explicitly not allowed. If you go to any good dungeon, there is literally a conversation about consent, must having negotiation, must have consent, so on and so forth. There are even some dungeons that have classes about what negotiations are. There are even dungeons that have printouts of basically the rules on the walls. There's no surprise grabbing. There's no surprise assumptions, right? There's no entitlement. Again, when people walk through the door here through my venue, I always ask them if they know what consent is, if they've been to different parties before, what kind of parties they've been to, like how long have they been in the lifestyle, what events they've gone to, what is their experience, because you can never assume someone's knowledge, and common sense is not common. I don't care if I have to talk about what consent is 1,000 times. I would rather be asked the same question 1,000 times and explain myself 1,000 times than allow somebody to assume what the answer is and then make a mistake and do it wrong and then just fuck it up. So this whole myth of being touched without consent, this is from a fear of not knowing what consent is and then not having consent enforced, or understanding that in a dungeon space, consent is not optional. Here's a little bit of a reality check. We're going to talk about clubs versus dungeons. Let's be completely honest with each other. At clubs, people get groped, people get shoved, people get cornered, people get pressured, people get followed to bathrooms, followed into bathrooms. Horrible things have happened at clubs, okay? And it happens consistently. There are attacks on people in clubs, outside of clubs, lots of violence that happens between both genders, all genders, same genders. Again, it depends on where you go. Nothing happens. I have literally stopped going to vanilla clubs, vanilla club spaces, goth clubs that I used to love going to. I don't go there anymore. Dance clubs, nightclubs. I have even stopped going to certain city gay bars and gay clubs because in those vanilla places, I get groped and touched and grabbed and fondled, and no one has ever asked me for permission. So I'm always over here in a club trying to fight with people because someone grabbed my ass and now I'm swinging on the dance floor, all right? I have never been to a vanilla space where they talked about consent. They talked about check-ins other than checking ID at the door. There are no safe words. There is no staff that's basically trained for consent or to basically stop a problem. So whenever we're in a vanilla space, you have to keep in mind that people in vanilla spaces, they are security. They are not really trained to de-escalate a problem. They are not trained to recognize a problem. And this is a problem. This whole thing is a problem because they don't de-escalate. They don't stop something. They don't interfere. They basically are called in when that problem and situation has escalated so much so that there's physical violence. At that point, when there's physical violence or someone is super like inebriated, drunk, vomiting everywhere, that is when the security guards basically come in and just throw the person out. And I'm sure that you've seen dozens of Instagram videos, TikToks, YouTubes. There's dozens of things out there where you're seeing drunk people literally get just tossed out of the club and onto the floor, onto the curb, into the street, and that's the end of that. I don't understand how places like that is more, I guess, comfortable and, dare I even say, familiar. Due to those types of environments being so familiar and being so known and like socially acceptable, people will call that normal instead of dangerous. I am going to take a little bit of a sidestep here and kind of circle back into another category that I've talked about before, and this is social anxiety. People have a fear of being seen. So the fear itself is not necessarily a physical fear, like, oh my gosh, it's social. What if somebody I know sees me? What if someone that I work with sees me? What are they going to think about me if they see me at this place with these people? What label are they going to place on me by coming to this place? A real fear for a lot of people is that judgment is going to befall them by someone they know, and it's going to basically put them outside of the quote unquote normal social boxes that they're used to. And that fear of judgment is actually significantly louder than the fear of actual harm itself. A lot of people also confuse curiosity with identity. And this means that people think when they step into a dungeon, they are suddenly becoming something permanent and it is 100%, and they do not have the ability to basically leave or change it. So just because you're curious does not mean you are committed. Curiosity does not automatically equal commitment. Observation does not equal participation. Interest itself does not equal identity. We can be interested in dozens of things. I love plants. I am a plant daddy. I am a plant enthusiast. I import plants. I cross-pollinate plants. I do my own seeds. I have very specific types of succulents that I import and then I clone them. Different story. But just because I am curious about plants and I look at plants and I like plants, it does not mean that plants are the sole focal point of my identity and who I am. Yes, me being a plant enthusiast is a part of who I am. It is a piece of who I am, right? But that does not make me who I am. It is part of a bigger picture. These types of misunderstandings, this is what keeps vanilla people away as well. One of the other things that actually I have personally encountered when I do talk to vanilla people about potentially coming to my venue is there's this extreme anxiety of not understanding the rules and being afraid to break them. A lot of people don't want to cause problems. They don't want to make mistakes. It makes us feel uncomfortable, right? We're going to make mistakes first and foremost. We are human, or human enough, right? With that being said, when you make a mistake, hopefully it's not a huge one. And if it is a big one, you can accept accountability for your actions, apologize, and move on. With that being said, making a single mistake does not define you. Again, we are humans, human enough, human adjacent. We're going to make mistakes. We're not perfect. We should not be so afraid of making a mistake that itself, the fear of making a mistake, is going to cause us to miss out on things, to keep ourselves from going out and trying new experiences and doing things like learning and exploring. This is all normal. And realistically, if you think that you've gone through life and not made a single mistake, then that's crazy, because I'm sure that you have. Again, totally fine. But you should have learned from it, right? We have a lesson here. We learned to move forward. You didn't just be born and then start running. You had to crawl before you walk, the whole thing. So we're going to make mistakes. It's okay to mess up. Obviously, some mistakes are absolutely horrific. And in a true dungeon space, you are going to be told the rules. People are going to educate you. I did mention earlier that some dungeons literally have signs everywhere about the do's and don'ts of when you're present. So we're not going to set you up for failure. Good places are not going to allow you to fail. They're going to do the best that they can to educate you and to give you a really good idea of the expectations of what is allowed versus what isn't allowed. And then we're going to go from there. Then that is when you have the choice to make decisions or to do choices. And those choices can definitely get you in trouble or get you a partner. Vanilla people are not just afraid of making a mistake, they're afraid of breaking invisible rules. They're also afraid of being embarrassed. Embarrassment definitely inhibits people's reactions. I had a stand up comedian come in a few weeks ago, and again, I wish more people would have come. He was hilarious. I was laughing so hard, it was completely inappropriate, but absolutely worth it. Anyways, he had mentioned that people don't like to hear themselves laugh. And that's, again, a social anxiety because they don't want to be the loudest one in the room. Embarrassment can definitely hinder us, and we got to try to move away from those things. Another thing people are afraid of is being publicly corrected. As anyone knows, yes, there are mistakes that need to be corrected, but you shouldn't be afraid of being told that you did something wrong. Again, this is a learning moment, but also the way in which you're spoken to can cause that fear of being publicly corrected. There is a huge difference between constructive criticism and then just being condescending. If you've only ever been in a situation where you are condescended by your family, your friends, your bosses, this completely makes sense as to why you don't like being publicly corrected. In the same aspect, if you have that constructive criticism, it gives you the chance to learn from this mistake, don't do it again, and then move on. They don't realize that in a dungeon space, we expect to have newbies, and we cater basically the room, the conversations to including them and educating them and giving them some structure that they're not going to get in the normal world to ensure that they don't make mistakes. I can guarantee you right now, as a kinky person, I do not want to set up any of my first timers or my vanilla friends up for failure. I'm going to over communicate with you. I'm going to give you all of the definitions. I'm going to answer as many questions as I possibly can for you. That way you can have a better understanding of what's occurring. You can have a better chance of like expectations and knowing. So that way you're comfortable, because if you're uncomfortable, I can see it. As somebody who's, very aware, I'm very hyper aware. I can see the level of discomfort on people's faces. And if you are that uncomfortable, I want you to know it makes everyone else just as uncomfortable. And we don't want to live like that. There is this confidence of illusion. People imagine that everybody inside of a dungeon is confident. They are hot, right? The bodies. And experienced. No nerves, no awkwardness, no hesitation. I think because of how the media has portrayed kink scenes and dungeons, we're having all of these billionaires with these very sharp, tight jaw lines, these six packs, these muscles, these very thin, petite, 5'5", 100-pound bodies with big breasts and big lips and all of those augmentations. They don't understand that that is not reality. People have a hard time understanding reality versus fantasy because of social media, because of Hollywood, because of the images that are sold to them in movies. Those movies are an individual's perception of what they think kink is. And I'm going to be 100% with you right now. Yes. Some people that come to the dungeon are fucking hot. Like, oh my God, right? I think inappropriate, lustful thoughts, but I still try to be respectful. My eyes are up here, right? However, your average human body does not look like the actors that you see on the screen or that are in these dungeon settings. So there is hesitation. There is awkwardness. Let me let you know right now, I have a type. It's neurodivergent and awkward. I like sassy, awkward people, and I too am very awkward. If you actually listen to one of my previous podcasts, I mentioned liking this girl, and I started talking to her about dirt. Yes, I mean dirt, like literal dirt, the dirt for plants. And it was I don't even know how she kind of kept with that conversation. I'm sure I made myself look like an idiot because I talked to her about dirt because that was all I could think of. Welcome to me. Do you think I felt confident doing that? No. Definitely wanted to hide in the bathroom stall and maybe consider my life choices, but there's tons of awkwardness, right? Half of the room remembers their very first night in a kink space. And whether that was perceived good or bad all depends on how the space was equipped and or trained on how to deal with new people who are new to kink. Vanilla people also think that there's pain without context. And when there's pain without context, that feels violent. That is violence, right? Pain scares people, and it scares people for a reason. If there is no explanation, these tools look like weapons. I had a very funny conversation with one of the people that comes here, and I think it was their first time coming to the venue. And I was going over all of the rules, being very thorough. I tend to just kind of overtalk sometimes. And I had mentioned something similar to yeah, there's no weapons. This man looked me dead in the eye, reached around, patted his duffel bag and said, "This is a bag full of weapons." And it's been an inside joke ever since, but realistically, he's absolutely correct. We have duffel bags of weapons. I have canes. I have floggers. I have whips. I have single tail whips. I have silicone toys. I have a hockey puck on a motherfucking stick. Yeah, I even have a fucking chancla. Yes, say it again. I actually had a custom made wooden chancla paddle from one of my favorite toy makers. I'll see if I can drop his name. I didn't ask him. I don't want to just deal without asking, but expect a promo for me about him later because he's fucking awesome. Anyways, I literally had a wooden chancla made specifically for me to punish people. Okay? That is a weapon. Our tool bags, our kinky toolkit has these things that can definitely hurt people if you don't know what you're doing with them. Being restrained, that's literally trapping some people, and that causes them to feel like they're in a dangerous situation. Intensity for some people looks like harm. I had this friend many years ago, and I can't remember what brought up the conversation. And she said, "Nova, people already don't like us." And I was just shocked, I guess, because we were just sitting down having wine. It was like a casual Sunday. And I didn't understand what she meant at the time. And I said, "Why? What do you mean that they don't like us?" And she said, "People don't like that we practice rack. And because those people don't like the heavier style of play that we do, like knife play and sharp play and needle play and wax play and fire play, they already consider us dangerous." And that was a really eye-opening moment for me. There are different styles of BDSM, and there's a whole bunch of acronyms, things like that. We'll talk about that on another podcast. But I really had a moment and I realized that, yeah, even within the scene, there is a big separation between people who do SSC and rack play. And some people who really don't agree with rack play will have this overly judgmental idea that that particular play is taboo, it is bad, it is horribly dangerous, and it should not be practiced by anybody. The thing that everyone needs to realize is that the biggest thing and the thing that is missing in this type of context is literally negotiation. It is pacing, and above all, it is actually getting active and informed consent. One of the other things that vanilla people tend to bring up a lot about being very hesitant or not coming to a dungeon space is the fear of losing control. A lot of people are worried to lose control. They think that once they start a scene that they cannot end it. They don't understand that consent can be given freely and be taken freely at any time during the scene. They don't know that because that's not practiced or talked about or discussed or enforced in everyday vanilla life. Once you are in a dungeon and you revoke consent, everything stops. And if it doesn't, we're fucking throwing chairs. We're throwing chairs and we're throwing hands, okay? Your safety is the most important thing. And that's what is one of the biggest things about true dungeons. We enforce consent and we stop it, right? We stop it if it goes too far. We prevent it from escalation. We literally do our best to de-escalate because we want everyone to be safe. With that being said, vanilla people don't understand this, and they worry that they're going to get caught in some situation that they're not going to be able to escape. They're going to be afraid that they're going to be trapped. They're going to be tied up. They're going to freeze. They're not going to be able to speak for themselves. And then we have the people pleasers, which they're horribly afraid of disappointing people and that they're going to regret it. Dungeons and kink spaces, again, these are one of the few spaces where stopping is literally normal. It is normalized. It is respected. It is encouraged. No one's going to be upset if you stop. And if they do, they're a shitty fucking dominant or a shitty fucking top and they need to reassess their lives. We don't deal with people like that. But once something happens, again, this is not a dungeon is not a place where you go and then you lose all autonomy. It's where you have the most autonomy that you may ever have in any kind of public space. And I'm using finger quotes for public. There's also this inherent shame that I get from vanilla people about wanting, right? A lot of people have been taught that to want, that having desire is bad. It's taboo. It's suspicious. That curiosity is risky and it can potentially hurt you. Also, because there's so many perfect little boxes that we're forced to fit into, they're taught that wanting something outside of the norm, wanting something different, is a moral failure. And I'm here to tell you that that is absolutely not true. And this mindset is actually one of the biggest reasons that they avoid coming in, because now they're limiting themselves based on what they were taught and being taught that desire was bad. And unfortunately, instead of following their curiosity and then being willing to learn, they basically shy away from everything. And in this aspect, unfortunately, fear, it feels safer than self-knowledge. There's also the fear of pressure. Some people are very worried that they'll be talked into something that they don't like, and politeness will be mistaken for consent. That boundaries are not going to be respected or they're not going to be heard. Ironically, that literally happens every day, more often and consistently in vanilla dating than will ever happen in a true kink space. Let's talk about the horror stories. So just a quick understanding that someone having a singular bad experience is 8 times more likely to tell 8 different people. A person having a single good experience is only going to tell 3 people. So word of mouth makes a difference. You're never going to hear a viral story about safe or boring dungeon nights, all right? You're only going to hear about these extremes. You're only going to hear about mistakes. You're only going to hear about the bad things that happen. You're only ever hearing about abuse. And unfortunately, when you're only hearing about the bad things all the time, that's going to skew perception, and it's also going to reinforce fear. Power exchange also can look scarier than it is to people who don't know what TPE is or what power exchange actually is. Power exchange tends to terrify people because it looks permanent. And for people who are living in a 24/7 or having like a master-slave dynamic, that is absolutely true. It looks like from the outside, they're giving something up forever. However, power in kink is always negotiated. It is temporary for the most part, and it is always revocable. When consent is given, it can easily be taken away at any time during the scene. And that distinction, it's not taught outside of kink. It's not enforced outside of kink. Again, you hear about all of these violations and you You hear about all of these horror stories and everyday club situations because people are entitled. They don't understand no, and there's no punishment or no enforcement for them to respect no or to respect boundaries. One of the biggest and cold hard truths that vanilla people need to understand, and they absolutely need to realize, is that vanilla culture, it literally avoids talking about consent in everyday situations, every day, all the time, everywhere. A lot of vanilla spaces assume that consent is obvious, but we know that's not true, right? Common sense is not common. Also, we never assume because assuming makes an ass out of you and me. People in vanilla spaces assume that consent is unspoken. They assume it's intuitive. Okay, that's not true. That is absolutely not true. Again, there are so many stories out there that you can research on your own of consent going horrible or things happening in vanilla clubs that are just atrocious. In kink spaces, we do nothing but talk about consent. We talk about it constantly. We make sure everyone knows what negotiation is, that they know what consent is. Also, side note, some of you out there, you don't know what consent is. And I've heard you talking recently, and it makes me sad because you pretend that you know what you're talking about, but then I hear you talking about it, and I'm like, they should definitely read a book. Anyways, Google is free. Our phones are out there. Educate yourself before saying things, because then it just makes everyone look at you and like, oh shit, you really don't know what you're talking about. Anyways, we talk about negotiation consistently, consent consistently. That level of explicitness, it feels intense to people. And then you understand why we talk about it so in depth and intensely. And then once you understand why it's such a big issue, then it's like, oh, okay, that makes sense now. Emotional exposure is also a real threat to some people. People, yes, they're afraid of pain, but they're not just afraid of pain. They're afraid of honesty. They're afraid of confronting their own limits, naming their own limits. They're afraid of being seen clearly. Dungeons require emotional literacy that a lot of people do not have. They don't have the skill set for it. They never learned it, or they were never taught about emotional literacy, and it is a huge problem. There's also this myth of like immediate participation for everybody in the dungeon setting. People think that when they come into a dungeon, that means that they have to participate. They have to act. They have to basically involve themselves physically in some way. And that's absolutely not true. People don't know that watching is okay, that pausing is okay, that they can leave. If you don't like something, please leave. Hey, you don't like that? Then don't do it, right? You don't have to stay there and watch a situation or a scene. You don't have to watch needle play if you don't like needles. You don't have to watch impact if you don't like watching people being hit. You can leave. You can walk away. You can look away. You're not forced to stay there and look. There is no performance requirement in any kind of valid kink space. So what actually happens is that a majority of dungeon nights are slow, right? In this economy, all right? It's also like one of the worst times right now. So basically, I'm going to be really honest with you. It's not just the dungeon spaces that are slow. It's every spaces that are slow. It's the holiday season from November to like February, super slow. And even then, I want to let you know, a lot of nights don't have 80 people in the room. A lot of nights are slow, they're calm, but they're also intentional. They're intimate, they're sensual. People talk because here, this isn't a club, this isn't a gangbang. If you want to go to a gangbang, by all means, please go to a gangbang. If you want to go to an orgy, please go to an orgy. Read the description, okay? But at dungeons, it's not about sex. It's not just sex. It's connection. It's being social. There's lots of talking. There's lots of negotiation. And a majority of the night, people are talking and socializing before they play. There's constant check-in. Reality is a lot quieter than fantasy. And that's why a lot of people don't really seem interested in knowing what's actually happening. They're caught up in the fantasy of what they've been told. We need to fight this with education. Okay, education here is 100% the antidote. When people learn how dungeons actually function, the fear of entering a dungeon, it shrinks. Knowledge replaces imagination. It replaces assumption. Structure replaces panic. Consent replaces assumption. This is why education matters. So realistically, I hope this helped with some of the newbies about just a little bit, I guess, about with understanding what actually happens when it kind of keeps them out of the spaces we're trying to invite them into. What to expect? Honestly, expect something casual. Expect something lighthearted. This isn't a gangbang. This isn't a sex party. It's not an orgy. This isn't a place where bad things happen. I know what you've been told. I know what you've seen on social media. But in my dungeon, in my space, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Participation is not required. You're not forced to do anything with anybody. Nobody is going to touch you without asking. No one's going to touch you without your permission. I'm sorry, I should say that. Just because someone asks you something does not mean that they get to do those things unless you've said yes. The only reason why things are going to happen to you is if you consent to it. You are going to ask them things. They're going to ask you things. You're going to clarify things. You're going to ask in-depth questions, weird questions, awkward health questions. Every single time I play with somebody, I ask them if they have health issues, if they're on medication. When's the last time they've eaten? Was it a big meal or a small meal? When's the last time you've had water? I know it seems weird, but for me, that's me figuring out their body and what they're okay with. The whole myth of just like being attacked in a small dark room where people are watching you get abused and no one stepping in, that's not going to happen. That's not reality of a real dungeon space. Lots of dungeons are safe. Lots of places you go to validate consent. They talk about consent and they enforce consent. And the best part is that there is literally DMs and dungeon monitors that are there to de-escalate a situation. If they see that you're uncomfortable, they are literally there to see and make sure that you are fine, to check in with you, to make sure that you're not uncomfortable, to make sure that you're not in danger, to make sure you have not been pushed past your limit and you cannot move away. If you're afraid of dungeons, that's okay. It's not a problem. You're just uninformed. And we can fix that. Fear, it thrives where information is missing. But reality, that's basically given to you via education, that fills the gap. And once that fantasy collapses, I'm gonna promise you that most people realize that the dungeon is probably one of the safest places you can be compared to that club down the street. So that was a little bit of a response to some questions that I've had recently. If you have any questions, feel free to DM me, send me some messages. You can drop comments here in the community for any of my channels. I appreciate you joining me on this very first Sunday of the brand new year. Make sure you guys stay hydrated. Make sure you ask all of the questions. Make sure you are advocating for yourself. Make sure that you get those new toys that you've been eyeing for the last few months. And thank you for tuning in to episode 19 of This Is Why I'm Not Invited. I'm the one and only Nova Nebula, and I'll see you next Sunday.